What happens when the woman you've spent 5 years treating like a naive, helpless burden is secretly pulling the strings of the biggest corporate buyout of the decade? Richard thought his wife's little consulting hobby was a pathetic joke. He openly laughed when she asked for quiet time to take calls. He didn't know those calls were to European tech magnates, and he certainly didn't know that while he was planning to leave her, she was busy closing an $840 million deal that would ultimately decide his own fate. The clinking of crystal wine glasses at Le Jardin, Chicago's most exclusive French fusion restaurant, always sounded to Josephine like the ringing of a very expensive, very pretentious bell. Josephine, or Jo, as everyone called her, sat quietly at the edge of the mahogany table, swirling a $200 Cabernet she had barely tasted. Across from her sat her husband, Richard Caldwell. Richard was a vice president of regional sales at a mid-tier logistics company, a title he wore like a royal decree. He had the sharp jawline, the perfectly tailored Italian suits, and the booming, confident laugh of a man who firmly believed he was the smartest person in any room he entered. To Richard's left sat Gregory Finch, the senior VP of his firm, and Gregory's wife, Brittany. The dinner was supposed to be a strategic maneuver for Richard, a way to schmooze his way into a corner office. Jo was simply there as a prop, a quiet, smiling accessory. "So, Jo," Gregory leaned forward, swirling his bourbon. "Richard tells me you've been trying your hand at the whole work-from-home thing. Dropshipping, was it? Or Etsy?" Before Jo could even open her mouth to reply, Richard's booming laugh echoed across the table. He reached over, patting Jo's hand with a suffocating, patronizing gentleness. "Oh, Greg, let's not bore the table," Richard chuckled, flashing his perfectly bleached teeth. "Jo's got a little LLC. She does some freelance bookkeeping, administrative stuff. She calls it consulting, bless her heart. It keeps her busy while I'm at the office pulling the real weight. You know how it is. You have to let them have their hobbies so they don't spend all day watching daytime television." Brittany giggled into her napkin. Jo felt the heat rise in her cheeks, but her expression remained an impenetrable mask of serene politeness. She didn't yank her hand away. She didn't snap back. She just offered a soft, practiced smile. "It passes the time," Jo said softly. "Exactly," Richard beamed, taking a large gulp of his wine. "I keep telling her she should just close it down. The accountant complained last year that her little tax deductions were more trouble than the revenue she brings in. I told her, 'Honey, let me just buy you a country club membership.' But she's stubborn." Jo stared at the reflection of the chandelier in her water glass. 5 years ago, when they first married, Richard wasn't like this. He had been ambitious, sure, but encouraging. However, as he climbed the middle management ladder, his ego had inflated to dangerous proportions. He became obsessed with status, with the perception of power. In Richard's mind, there could only be one alpha in the household. When Jo lost her corporate job 3 years ago during a massive round of tech layoffs, Richard had secretly rejoiced. He loved being the sole provider. He loved the power dynamic, so Jo had let him believe it. She let him believe that the quiet hours she spent in the spare bedroom, which Richard derogatorily called her craft room, were spent organizing spreadsheets for local bakeries and dog-walking businesses. She let him believe that her income barely covered her own groceries. What Richard didn't know was that Jo hadn't just been organizing spreadsheets. She had been building Hayes Advisory, a boutique mergers and acquisitions proxy firm. She specialized in acting as a ghost broker for massive, highly confidential corporate buyouts. Tech startups that didn't want the market to panic, legacy conglomerates trying to acquire disruptors quietly. They came to Joe. As Richard droned on to Gregory about his golf handicap and his vision for the logistics supply chain, Joe felt her phone vibrate in her clutch. She slipped it out under the table, shielding the screen. It was an encrypted message on Signal from her attorney and closest confidant, Samantha Briggs. Sam. Kessler just agreed to the revised term sheet, 840 M. All cash. They want to move to final signatures by Friday. We did it, Joe. Joe's breath caught in her throat. $840 million. For 14 months, she had been the sole architect of Project Icarus, the acquisition of a revolutionary solid-state battery startup, Nexus Energy, by the German industrial giant, the Kessler Group. She had navigated hostile board members, grueling midnight negotiations across 3 time zones, and endless due diligence nightmares. Her standard broker fee for a deal of this magnitude, structured meticulously through offshore holding companies to maintain her absolute anonymity until closing, was 3%, $25.2 million. In less than a week, it would be wired directly into a private trust she controlled. Earth to Josephine! Richard's sharp voice snapped her back to reality. He was snapping his fingers in front of her face, a deeply disrespectful gesture that made the waiter walking by cringe. Put the phone away, sweetie. The adults are talking about the economy. Joe looked at her husband. She looked at his smug, sneering face, his expensive Rolex that he had put on a payment plan just to impress men like Gregory. A cold, absolute calm washed over her. My apologies, Richard, Joe said, her voice smooth as silk. She slipped the phone back into her purse. It was just a spam text. Please tell us more about your quarterly projections. The next morning began like any other in the Caldwell household, a meticulously choreographed dance of Richard's self-importance. At 7:00 a.m., the espresso machine was whirring. Joe stood at the marble kitchen island, wearing comfortable yoga pants and an oversized grey sweater, pouring Richard's coffee into his insulated travel mug. Richard marched into the kitchen, smelling heavily of designer cologne, buttoning his suit jacket. I need my grey slacks dry cleaned by tomorrow, Richard ordered, not bothering with a good morning. He snatched the coffee from her hand. And see if you can call the landscapers. The hedges look like garbage. If I'm bringing the regional director over for cigars on Friday, the house needs to look like a VP lives here, not a high school guidance counselor. I'll call them, Joe said evenly. Richard paused at the door, looking her up and down with a faint expression of disgust. Are you going to wear those sweatpants all day? You know, Chloe in marketing. She works from home on Tuesdays, and she still puts on a blouse. It's about respecting yourself, Joe. Maybe if you dressed for success, your little business would actually turn a profit. Joe didn't flinch. She had learned long ago that reacting to Richard's barbs only fueled his ego. Have a good day at work, Richard. He rolled his eyes, grabbed his briefcase, and walked out. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut. Joe waited exactly 30 seconds, listening to the roar of his leased BMW pulling out of the driveway. Then her entire demeanor shifted. The soft, submissive housewife vanished. Joe walked briskly down the hallway to the craft room. She unlocked the door, stepping inside. There were no knitting needles or scrapbooks. The room was dominated by an L-shaped standing desk, equipped with 4 ultra-high-definition monitors. The walls were lined with whiteboards, covered in complex financial flowcharts, NDA trackers, and escrow timelines. She sat down, fired up her encrypted VPN, and initiated a secure video conference. Two faces popped up on the screen. One was Samantha, sharp-eyed and practically vibrating with caffeine energy from her New York office. The other was Arthur Kessler, the silver-haired, fiercely intimidating CEO of the Kessler Group, calling in from Munich. "Josephine." Arthur's deep, heavily accented voice came through the speakers. "I trust you received the confirmation from your legal team." "I did, Arthur," Jo said, her voice dropping an octave, radiating absolute authority. "But before we pop the champagne, we need to address the IP transition clauses in Section 4. Nexus Energy's founders are getting cold feet about handing over the proprietary code repository before the funds clear escrow. I've negotiated a blind trust holding for the code. My lawyers hold the keys until the $840 million hits the Nexus accounts, non-negotiable." Arthur frowned, leaning into his camera. "My board will not like that. They want the code the moment the ink is dry. Then your board can go out into the market and try to find another solid-state battery that holds a charge at -40 degrees, Jo fired back without missing a beat. "You hired me because I keep deals from falling apart at the 1-yard line. You will wire the funds, the trust will release the code automatically, and you will own the future of electric vehicles. Do we have a deal, Arthur, or do I need to make a phone call to your competitors in Tokyo?" There was a tense silence. Samantha watched with bated breath. Then Arthur chuckled. It was a rich, genuine sound of respect. "You are terrifying, Josephine. Truly. Very well. The blind trust is approved. Have the final contracts sent to my office by Thursday night. Pleasure doing business with you, Arthur." The call disconnected. Samantha let out a loud whoop on her end of the screen. "God, I love watching you work. You just bullied a German billionaire into submission in under 3 minutes." Jo allowed herself a genuine, exhausted smile. She leaned back in her ergonomic chair, rubbing her temples. "It's not bullying, Sam. It's leverage. How are the trust documents looking on our end?" Samantha's face grew serious. "The holding company, Aegis Capital, is fully incorporated in Delaware. The 3% broker fee, $25.2 million, will route directly there upon closing." "But Jo, we need to talk about Richard." Jo's smile faded. "What about him?" "I ran that quiet background financial check you asked for," Samantha said, pulling up a file on her end. "Jo, he's in deep. He took out a massive second mortgage on your house 3 months ago. He forged your signature on the loan documents." Jo sat up, dead straight. The air in the room suddenly felt very thin. "He what?" "He forged your signature," Samantha repeated grimly. "He took out $150,000 against the equity of the house. From what I can see in the bank routing traces, he dumped it all into some high-risk offshore crypto exchange that tanked last month. He's underwater. And," Samantha hesitated. "Tell me, Sam." "He's been making large, recurring purchases at a boutique jeweler downtown. Diamond bracelets, pearl necklaces. And unless you've got a secret jewelry box you're not telling me about, they aren't for you." Jo closed her eyes. The image of Richard at the door that morning flashed in her mind. Chloe in marketing. She still puts on a blouse. "Chloe," Jo whispered, the puzzle pieces slamming together with sickening clarity. "He's sleeping with the junior executive. Jo, if he defaults on that second mortgage, the bank takes the house. And legally, You're tied to that debt because your name is on it. We need to freeze his access, or you need to leave him before Friday. If this $25 million hits your personal accounts while you're married to this fraud, he could be entitled to half of it in a divorce under state law. No, Jo said, her eyes opening, cold and sharp as shattered glass. If I divorce him now, the forensic accountants will pause my assets during discovery. It could delay the Kessler deal. I am not letting Richard ruin 14 months of my life. Then what are you going to do? Sam asked, deeply concerned. Jo stared at the blinking cursor on her screen. She thought of all the dinners where she was mocked, the patronizing pats on the hand, the forged signatures, the infidelity. I'm going to let him dig his own grave, Jo said quietly. Prepare a post-nuptial agreement. Draft it carefully. Thursday evening arrived with the stifling tension of an impending thunderstorm. Jo was in the kitchen, casually chopping vegetables for dinner, when the front door slammed open. Richard stormed in, his tie undone, his face flushed with a mixture of panic and aggressive arrogance. He threw his leather briefcase onto the kitchen island, so hard it knocked over a bowl of cherry tomatoes. "We need to talk," Richard demanded, his voice echoing in the kitchen. Jo set the knife down slowly, wiping her hands on a towel. "Hello to you too, Richard. Bad day at the office?" "Don't give me the domestic housewife routine today, Jo," he snapped, pacing back and forth across the hardwood floor. He was sweating. "I've been doing a lot of thinking. About us. About our future." "Our future," Jo repeated neutrally. "Look at me," Richard said, gesturing grandly to himself. "I am on the verge of making regional director. I am dealing with high-level corporate strategies. I am moving up in the world, Jo. And you? You are stagnating." Jo leaned against the counter, crossing her arms. "I see. It's not just the stagnation, it's the embarrassment," Richard continued, building his own cruel momentum. "I had to explain to Greg today why my wife contributes 0 to our household income. It makes me look weak. It makes me look like I'm dragging an anchor. I need a partner who reflects my ambition. Someone young, hungry, driven." "Someone like Chloe in marketing?" Jo asked quietly. Richard froze. The color drained from his face for a fraction of a second before his ego overrode his panic. He sneered. "So you figured it out. Good. Saves me the trouble of breaking it to you gently. Yes, Chloe and I have a connection. She understands the corporate world. She actually knows what a balance sheet looks like." The irony was so thick Jo could have choked on it, but she maintained her absolute, terrifying calm. "I want a divorce, Jo," Richard stated, trying to regain the high ground. He reached into his briefcase and slammed a thick manila folder onto the granite counter. "But I'm not a monster. I'm willing to be generous. I've had my lawyers draft up a post-nuptial separation agreement." Jo looked at the folder, then back to him. "A post-nup? Why not just file the divorce papers?" Richard scoffed, looking nervous. "Because the courts take forever, and frankly, I don't want you trying to drag me through the mud to get alimony. This agreement is simple. We formally separate our assets as of today. What's mine is mine. What's yours is yours. You keep whatever pennies are in your little LLC checking account, and I keep my salary, my investments, and my bonuses. We sell the house, split the equity, and we walk away clean." Jo almost laughed. Split the equity. He was desperately trying to force the sale of the house to cover the $150,000, second mortgage he had fraudulently taken out, hoping to bury the debt in the chaos of the divorce before she ever found out about the forgery. Furthermore, by separating their assets today, he was trying to protect his impending and entirely delusional promotion bonus from her. He thought he was being a shark. He had no idea he was swimming into the jaws of a leviathan. You want me to sign a legally binding document stating that as of today, neither of us has any claim to the other's current or future business assets, income, or corporate holdings? Jo asked, her voice deliberately trembling, playing the part of the overwhelmed wife. Exactly, Richard said, puffing out his chest, smelling blood in the water. It's the cleanest way. If you don't sign it, Jo, I swear to God I will drag this out in court until you are completely bankrupt. I will hire the most vicious lawyers in Chicago. You won't see a dime. Sign the paper, take the house equity, and go start over. Maybe get a real job. Jo looked down at the document. It was a standard, aggressively worded separation of assets. If she signed it, she would legally forfeit any right to Richard's money. But it also meant Richard legally forfeited any right to hers. Tomorrow was Friday. Tomorrow, at 10:00 a.m., the Kessler Group would wire $40 million to Nexus Energy, triggering the immediate payout of a $25.2 million broker fee to Jo's holding company. If she signed this document right now, that $25 million would be entirely, untouchably hers. Richard would have no legal recourse to claim a single cent of it. Jo let out a shaky breath, forcing a tear to pool in the corner of her eye. You're really doing this, Richard? After 5 years, you're just throwing me away for a junior executive. Richard sighed, adopting a tone of fake sympathy that made Jo's stomach turn. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Jo. We just outgrew each other. I'm destined for bigger things. You just couldn't keep up. He handed her a sleek Montblanc pen, one she had bought him for their first anniversary. Sign it, Jo. It's for the best. Jo took the pen. She looked at Richard's smug, punchable face. She thought about the $150,000 forged loan that was about to explode in his face once the house went into escrow. She thought about his grand delusion of corporate supremacy. With a swift, fluid motion, Jo signed her name on the dotted line. There, Jo whispered, handing the folder back to him. Richard snatched it up triumphantly. Smart girl. My lawyer will file this with the county clerk first thing tomorrow morning. You have 30 days to pack your things. He turned and walked out of the kitchen, whistling a cheerful tune, utterly oblivious to the fact that he had just legally signed away $25 million. Jo stood alone in this kitchen. She looked at the chopped vegetables. Then she walked over to the trash can and scraped them all in. She wouldn't be cooking tonight. She pulled out her phone and sent a single text message to Samantha. He signed it. File our version of the counter documents in the morning. And Sam, tell Kessler we are clear for closing. Friday morning broke over Chicago with a brilliant, blinding clarity. The city skyline gleamed against the cold Lake Michigan winds, but inside the Caldwell residence, the atmosphere was completely still. Richard had left at 6:30 a.m., practically whistling as he adjusted his Salvatore Ferragamo tie in the hallway mirror. He hadn't said goodbye to Jo. He had simply yelled, "Don't forget to pack up your craft supplies," before letting the front door slam shut. At 8:45 a.m., Jo sat in her command center. The 4 ultra-high-definition monitors cast a cool blue glow across her face. Today, she wasn't wearing sweatpants. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer, her hair pulled back into a severe, elegant knot. She looked exactly like what she was, an apex predator in the financial ecosystem. On the center screen, a secure zoom grid displayed the most powerful players in the tech and industrial sectors. Arthur Kessler sat in his Munich boardroom, flanked by 3 men in dark suits. Below him was David Chen, the brilliant but notoriously anxious founder of Nexus Energy. In the bottom right corner was Samantha Briggs, sipping black coffee from a paper cup, sitting alongside 2 senior partners from Kirkland & Ellis, the ruthless corporate law firm Joe had retained to handle the escrow mechanics. "We are T-minus 15 minutes from the market opening in New York," Joe announced, her voice slicing through the digital static. "Arthur, has J.P. Morgan Chase confirmed receipt of the transfer authorizations?" "We are locked and loaded, Josephine," Arthur replied, tapping a silver pen against his desk. "My CFO is standing by. The moment you release the blind trust holding the proprietary code, the $840 million will be wired." David Chen adjusted his glasses, looking terrified. "And my board? We get the cash immediately? No deferred stock options? No performance clauses?" "As negotiated, David," Joe said smoothly. "All cash, a clean break. You walk away today a very wealthy man, and Arthur walks away with the monopoly on solid-state battery technology." "Samantha, status on the secondary filings?" Samantha leaned into her microphone, her eyes flashing with a hidden, triumphant gleam that only Joe understood. "The corporate filings are primed. And on a personal note, Joe, the other paperwork you requested was physically stamped by the Cook County Clerk's office at exactly 8:05 a.m. It is a matter of public record, irrevocable and ironclad." Joe exhaled slowly. The post-nuptial agreement. It was filed. The trap had formally snapped shut. Richard had legally severed himself from her assets, permanently. "Excellent," Joe murmured. "Gentlemen, the time is 8:59 a.m. Let's make history." At precisely 9:40 a.m., Joe executed a keystroke on her mechanical keyboard. A green loading bar on her second monitor filled rapidly as the encrypted proprietary algorithms for Nexus Energy's solid-state batteries were released from their digital vault and transferred directly into the Kessler Group's private servers. "Code received," Arthur's voice boomed, a rare grin breaking across his stoic German features. "Executing wire." For 30 agonizing seconds, the only sound in the virtual room was the heavy breathing of billionaires and lawyers. Then the escrow notification chimed. A digital ledger from J.P. Morgan Chase materialized on Joe's screen. Wire transfer confirmed. $840,000 USD, deposited to Nexus Energy Holdings. David Chen let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Oh my God. We did it. Josephine, you absolute legend. We did it." "Congratulations, David," Joe said warmly. A second later, a private, encrypted ping hit Joe's personal banking dashboard. Wire transfer confirmed. $25,200,000 USD, deposited to Aegis Capital LLC. $25.2 million, liquid, untouchable, hers. "It's been a pleasure doing business with you all," Joe said, her heart pounding a steady, victorious rhythm in her chest. "Arthur, enjoy the future of electric vehicles. David, enjoy your retirement. I am officially logging off," she ended the call. The silence in the room was deafening. Joe stared at the $25 million sitting in her holding account. 5 years of being belittled. 5 years of Richard treating her like a slow-witted child. 5 years of hiding her brilliance to protect the fragile ego of a mediocre man. It was over. Jo stood up. She didn't pack her craft supplies. She didn't pack the cheap dishes they had bought together, or the linens, or the ugly abstract paintings Richard insisted on hanging in the living room. She packed exactly 2 large suitcases of her own designer clothes, which she had secretly bought and kept hidden in the guest closet, her jewelry, her passports, and her encrypted hard drives. Before she rolled her luggage to the front door, she walked into the kitchen. She took a crisp, white envelope and placed it dead center on the granite island. Inside the envelope was a printed copy of the J.P. Morgan Chase wire transfer for $25.2 million. Beneath it was a copy of the $150,000 second mortgage loan document. Jo had used a bright red Sharpie to circle Richard's clumsy forgery of her signature, and at the very bottom she wrote a simple note. "I told you the post-nup was a bad idea, Richard. Good luck with Chloe." Jo walked out the front door, climbed into the black, chauffeur-driven Mercedes Maybach she had ordered an hour ago, and instructed the driver to take her to the Four Seasons penthouse suite. At 2:00 p.m., Richard Caldwell was practically floating down the glass-walled corridors of Meridian Logistics. His chest was puffed out, his suit perfectly pressed. He had spent his lunch hour at an expensive steakhouse with Chloe, a 24-year-old junior marketing executive who hung on his every word. He had bragged to her about his impending promotion, about how he had masterfully managed his deadweight wife out of his life, and how he was going to buy a Porsche 911 the moment his new vice president contract was signed. "Richard!" a voice called out sharply. Richard turned to see Gregory Finch's administrative assistant, looking at him with a tight, uncomfortable expression. "Gregory needs you in the main conference room. Now." "Of course, Linda," Richard beamed, straightening his tie. This is it, he thought. The promotion. He swaggered into the conference room, expecting to see a bottle of champagne or at least a firm handshake from the executive board. Instead, the room felt like a morgue. Gregory Finch sat at the head of the long oak table, looking like he had aged 10 years since their dinner at Le Jardin. Next to him sat the company's chief financial officer and the head of human resources. There was no champagne. "Greg, Bob, what's the occasion?" Richard asked, oblivious to the toxic atmosphere, pulling out a leather chair. "Sit down, Richard," Gregory snapped. His voice was devoid of its usual jovial frat boy camaraderie. It was cold and sharp. Richard blinked, slowly lowering himself into the chair. "Is something wrong?" "You could say that," the CFO, a notoriously ruthless woman named Barbara, interjected. She slid a thick, red-tabbed folder across the table toward him. As of 10:00 a.m. this morning, Meridian Logistics lost its largest regional anchor account. Richard's stomach did a nervous flip. "Which account?" "Nexus Energy," Gregory said grimly. "They were just acquired by the Kessler Group in a massive, unannounced buyout. Kessler's transition team sent us a notice of immediate termination of all vendor contracts. They are vertically integrating their entire supply chain, bringing all logistics in-house." Richard swallowed hard. Nexus Energy constituted 40% of his entire sales portfolio. It was the only reason his quarterly numbers looked passable. It was the sole justification for his VP promotion. "Well," Richard stammered, wiping a sudden bead of sweat from his forehead. That's a setback. But we can pivot. I can mobilize my sales team to acquire new local tech startups. You don't have a sales team anymore, Richard, Gregory interrupted, leaning forward, his eyes narrowing. Without the Nexus account, your regional division is operating at a massive net loss. The board just had an emergency meeting. We are restructuring. Restructuring? Richard's voice cracked. Greg, come on. I'm in line for regional director. We talked about this. You can't penalize me for a corporate buyout I couldn't possibly foresee. I'm not penalizing you, Richard. I'm firing you, Gregory said flatly. The words hit Rich like a physical blow to the chest. All the air left his lungs. What? The HR director slid a single piece of paper across the table. It was a severance agreement. Effective immediately, your employment at Meridian Logistics is terminated. We will offer you 2 weeks of severance pay, provided you sign this NDA and non-compete. 2 weeks! Richard exploded, shooting up from his chair. I gave this company 5 years. You can't just throw me out. I have a mortgage. I have... He stopped abruptly, a sickening wave of nausea washing over him. The second mortgage. The $150,000 he had taken out to dump into that catastrophic crypto scheme. I was depending on his 6-figure promotion bonus to quietly pay it off before the bank started asking questions. This is a business, Richard, Gregory said coldly, standing up to match him. Your middle management. Your numbers tanked, so you're out. Pack up your desk. Security will escort you from the building in 15 minutes. Richard stumbled out of the conference room, his vision blurring. The world was spinning out of control. He staggered past the marketing department, catching a glimpse of Chloe. When she saw him flanked by 2 large security guards carrying a cardboard box, she immediately looked down at her phone and walked in the opposite direction. 10 minutes later, Richard was standing on the sidewalk in the freezing Chicago wind, holding a box of desk toys and corporate awards that suddenly looked utterly pathetic. Panic set in. Pure, unadulterated panic. He dropped his box onto the hood of his leased BMW and frantically pulled out his phone. He needed cash. He needed to figure out how to cover his tracks. He dialed the customer service line for Chase Bank, his hands shaking uncontrollably. Welcome to Chase. Please enter your account number, the automated voice droned. Richard punched in his details, waiting for a representative. Yes, hi, he practically yelled when a human finally answered. This is Richard Caldwell. I need to check the available equity line on my secondary mortgage. One moment, Mr. Caldwell, the representative said. There was a long pause, accompanied by the clicking of a keyboard. Sir, I'm seeing a hard freeze on this account. A freeze? What do you mean, a freeze? Unfreeze it. I cannot do that, sir. The repe's voice dropped into a severe, rehearsed tone. This account was flagged for severe fraudulent activity at 9:30 a.m. this morning. The secondary account holder, Josephine Caldwell, filed a sworn affidavit with our fraud division, complete with forensic documentation, proving her signature on the loan origination documents was forged. Richard's blood turned to ice. She. What? Furthermore, sir, because federal wire fraud is suspected, all associated checking and savings accounts under your name have been frozen, pending a full criminal investigation. We advise you to seek legal counsel. Goodbye. The line went dead. Richard stood frozen on the concrete. He couldn't breathe. Jo knew. She knew about the forgery. She knew about the debt. The post-enup. The memory of last night hit him like a freight train. He had forced her to sign a post-nuptial agreement, severing their assets. He thought he was trapping her, cutting her out of his future wealth and forcing her to take half the debt of the house. Instead, she had locked him out of everything. But why? She had nothing. She was just a glorified bookkeeper, making pennies on Etsy, driven by a desperate, rabid frenzy. Richard threw his box into the passenger seat, sped through 3 red lights, and tore down the highway toward his suburban home. He nearly took the hinges off the front door as he burst into the house. "Joe!" he screamed, his voice echoing off the hardwood floors. "Joe, where are you?" Silence. He ran through the living room, up the stairs, and into the master bedroom. Her closet was empty. Her jewelry box was gone. He ran back downstairs, panting, sweating through his expensive suit. That's when he saw it. The stark white envelope sitting dead center on the kitchen island. He stumbled toward it, his hands trembling violently as he ripped it open. First, he saw the copy of the forged loan document, his clumsy fake signature circled in bright, mocking red marker. Then he saw her handwritten note. "I told you the post-nup was a bad idea, Richard. Good luck with Chloe." And finally, he pulled out the bottom sheet of paper. It was a printed screenshot of a banking dashboard. J.P. Morgan Chase. Wire transfer confirmed. Account, Aegis Capital LLC. Sole proprietor, Josephine Caldwell. Amount deposited, £25,200,000. USD. Memo. Brokerage fee. Project Icarus. Nexus Energy acquisition. Richard stared at the number. $25,200,000. His brain refused to process it. Nexus Energy. The massive buyout that had just gotten him fired from his job. The $8.40 million corporate acquisition that had turned his entire industry upside down this morning. His wife, the woman he had mocked at dinners, the woman he had treated as a useless burden, the woman he had literally forced to sign away her legal rights to his superior wealth just 12 hours ago, was the architect behind the entire deal. She wasn't a bookkeeper. She was a corporate titan. And he had just handed her a legally binding document that ensured he would never see a single dime of her $25 million. Richard's legs gave out. He collapsed onto the kitchen floor, the piece of paper slipping from his hands, fluttering to the cold tiles like a dead leaf. He was jobless, penniless, facing federal fraud charges, and entirely, utterly alone. He had tried to bury her alive, never realizing she was the one holding the shovel. The weekend that followed was the longest, most agonizing 48 hours of Richard Caldwell's life. He didn't leave the house. He sat in the dark living room, surrounded by the empty echoes of a life he had completely detonated, drinking a bottle of cheap scotch he had found pushed to the back of a cabinet. Every time his phone buzzed, he flinched. He had tried calling Chloe 26 times. On the 27th attempt, an automated voice informed him that his number had been blocked. He tried logging into his retirement accounts, hoping to liquidate his 401k, to hire a defense attorney, but his corporate portal had been locked the moment Gregory Finch fired him. The small amount of personal savings he had left in his checking account was still frozen by J.P. Morgan Chase. I was trapped in a financial straitjacket of his own making. On Monday morning, at exactly 7:15 a.m., the heavy wooden door of the Caldwell residence rattled under a series of aggressive knocks. Richard, nursing a severe hangover and wearing the same rumpled slacks from Friday, stumbled to the foyer. He swung the door open, expecting to see a courier or perhaps a neighbor complaining about the unkempt hedges he had previously barked at Joe to manage. Instead, two men in windbreakers stood on the porch. "Richard Caldwell?" the taller one asked, flashing a leather-bound gold badge. "I'm Special Agent Thomas Miller with the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division. This is Agent Davis. We have a federal warrant to search these premises in connection with allegations of wire fraud and bank fraud. Step aside, please." Richard couldn't even form the words to protest. He simply backed away, his knees trembling violently as 6 more agents swarmed into the house. They didn't care about his designer furniture or his collection of expensive golf clubs. They went straight for his home office. They seized his laptop, his external hard drives, his filing cabinets, and every shred of paper that had his signature on it. "You don't understand," Richard stammered, leaning against the wall for physical support as Agent Miller handed him a copy of the warrant. "My wife, she set me up. She tricked me into signing a post-nuptial agreement. She's hiding $25 million. Agent Miller looked at him with a mixture of pity and absolute disdain. "Mr. Caldwell, your wife's assets are perfectly legal and fully documented. What isn't legal is forging a signature to secure a $150,000 line of credit across state lines, and then attempting to funnel those funds into an unregulated offshore cryptocurrency exchange to evade capital gains taxes. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you start using it." By noon, the agents were gone, leaving the house completely ransacked. By 2:00 p.m., a truck arrived in the driveway. The leasing company, notified of the fraud investigation and the sudden termination of Richard's employment, was repossessing the BMW. Richard watched through the window as his ultimate status symbol was unceremoniously hooked up to a rusted winch and dragged away. While Richard's world was crumbling into a heap of federal subpoenas and repossession notices, Josephine Caldwell was sitting on the private terrace of the Hôtel des Bergues in Geneva, Switzerland, breathing in the crisp, clean air of Lake Geneva. She wore a breathtakingly simple, tailored white silk suit. Her laptop was open on the wrought iron table, a silver pot of Darjeeling tea steaming beside it. Samantha Briggs, her attorney and closest friend, was seated across from her, looking incredibly smug as she reviewed a stack of legal briefs. "So," Samantha said, taking a sip of her tea and adjusting her designer sunglasses. "The house in Chicago is officially in pre-foreclosure. Chase Bank triggered the default clause the moment the FBI confirmed the signature was forged. Richard has been evicted. From what my private investigator tells me, he is currently living in a Motel 6 off Interstate 90, and he's being represented by a public defender who looks like he hasn't slept since 2018. Joe didn't smile. She just looked out at the tranquil blue water of the lake. There was no joy in Richard's destruction, only a profound, liberating sense of closure. She had surgically removed a tumor from her life, and the patient was finally recovering. "Did he try to contest the post-enup?" Joe asked, turning her attention back to her attorney. "Oh, he tried," Samantha laughed. "His public defender filed a motion claiming he signed it under duress. The judge literally laughed him out of chambers. Richard's own lawyer drafted the document. Richard presented it, and Richard filed it. It is airtight. You are legally untouchable, Joe. That $25 million is safe, secure, and currently generating a very handsome yield in your Swiss accounts." "Good," Joe said softly. "Has Arthur Kessler reached out?" "Yesterday," Samantha nodded, tapping her iPad. The Nexus energy integration is going smoother than anticipated. Kessler is so thrilled with your handling of the acquisition that he wants to put you on retainer. He's eyeing a lithium mining operation in Western Australia next. He explicitly said he won't make a move unless Hayes Advisory is brokering the deal. Jo allowed a genuine, warm smile to touch her lips. For 5 years, she had hidden her genius in a spare bedroom, playing the quiet, submissive wife, while a mediocre man stood on her shoulders and told the world he was flying. Now she was fielding calls from European billionaires who respected her intellect and feared her leverage. "Tell Arthur I'll take the meeting," Jo said, closing her laptop. "But my fee just went up to 4%. Samantha grinned. "I'll draft the engagement letter. But Jo, there's one more thing. Regarding Richard." Jo raised an eyebrow. "I thought we were done with him." "We are legally," Samantha said, pulling a specific red-tabbed folder from her briefcase. "But his criminal trial for the bank fraud is looming. The federal prosecutor reached out to me. Richard is desperate. He's terrified of going to federal prison. He wants a mediated settlement conference. He's begging to speak with you." "Why would I speak to him?" Jo asked, her voice turning cold. "Because," Samantha leaned in, tapping the red folder, "I have a play. A final, absolute checkmate. But you have to be willing to look him in the eye one last time." Jo looked at the folder, then out at the mountains in the distance. The air was cold, but she felt incredibly warm. "Set it up." 3 weeks later, Jo sat in a plush leather chair in a high-security conference room at Kirkland & Ellis's Chicago headquarters. She had flown in on a private jet the night before, completely undisturbed. Across the sprawling mahogany table sat Richard Caldwell. The physical transformation was jarring. Gone were the tailored Italian suits, the aggressive posture, and the expensive cologne. Richard looked hollow. He wore a cheap, ill-fitting grey suit that looked like it had been bought at a discount rack. His hair was thinning, his eyes were bloodshot, and his hands shook as they rested on the table. Beside him sat Gary Higgins, an exhausted, overworked public defender whose tie was stained with coffee. Samantha sat next to Jo, exuding the predatory calm of a shark circling a wounded seal. "Thank you for agreeing to this mediation, Mrs. Caldwell," Gary Higgins started, clearing his throat nervously. "My client is in a very precarious position. As you know, Chase Bank is pushing hard for the maximum federal penalty regarding the forged loan document. They want him to serve 5 to 7 years in federal prison to make an example out of him." Jo stared at Richard. He couldn't even meet her eyes. He was staring intensely at the grain of the wood on the table. "What does this have to do with me, Mr. Higgins?" Jo asked, her voice perfectly level. "Richard and I are legally separated. His debts and his crimes are his own. He insisted on that arrangement himself." Richard flinched at the reminder. "We are aware of the post-nuptial agreement," Higgins sighed, wiping his brow. "However, the prosecutor has indicated that if Chase Bank were to drop their aggressive push for incarceration, if the victimized institution felt restitution could be made, they would be willing to offer my client probation and community service instead of prison." "Again," Jo said, leaning back, "I am not Chase Bank. So why am I here?" Richard finally looked up. His eyes were brimming with desperate, humiliated tears. "Because you have $25 million, Jo," he whispered, his voice cracking. I know I messed up. I know I was awful to you. But I'm begging you, If you just pay off the $150,000 debt to the bank, they'll back off. It's pennies to you now. It's nothing to you. But it's my life. Please, Joe, don't let me go to prison." The sheer audacity of the request hung in the air like a foul odor. After 5 years of emotional abuse, after cheating on her, after forging her name and attempting to leave her utterly destitute, he was now begging her to use the very money he had mocked her for earning to save his skin. Joe didn't laugh. She didn't yell. She just looked at him with an icy, terrifying void of emotion. "Richard," Joe said softly, "do you remember the night at Le Jardin, when you told Gregory Finch that my business was a pathetic little hobby? When you said you were the one pulling the real weight?" Richard swallowed hard, a tear spilling down his cheek. "I was wrong. I was arrogant and stupid. I'm sorry." "You aren't sorry, Richard," Joe corrected him smoothly. "You're just cornered." She turned to Samantha and nodded. Samantha opened the red-tabbed folder and slid a single, heavily redacted legal document across the table. Gary Higgins picked it up, adjusting his glasses. As he read the cover page, the color completely drained from his face. This can't be right." "What?" Richard panicked, looking at his lawyer. "What is it?" 2 weeks ago, Joe said, her voice echoing with lethal precision in the quiet room, Chase Bank offloaded a bundle of toxic, non-performing debt to clear their quarterly ledgers. It's a standard practice for large commercial banks. They sell the bad debt for pennies on the dollar to private equity firms, who then assume the rights to collect. Richard stared at her, uncomprehending. "My holding company, Aegis Capital, purchased a specific bundle of that toxic debt," Joe continued. "Included in that bundle was a $150,000 fraudulent second mortgage originating from a property in Cook County." The realization hit like a physical strike. He gasped for air, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "I don't just have your money, Richard," Joe said, leaning forward, her eyes locking onto his soul. "I bought your debt. Chase Bank is no longer the victim in your federal fraud case. I am. I own the paper. I own the grievance. And I hold the sole authority to recommend leniency to the federal prosecutor." "Joe, please," Richard begged, openly weeping now. "Please, I'll do anything." "I know you will," Joe replied, completely unfazed by his tears. "I am not going to let you go to federal prison, Richard." Richard let out a massive, shuddering breath of relief, burying his face in his hands. "Thank you. Oh my God. Thank you, Joe." "Don't thank me yet," Joe interrupted, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Because if you go to prison, you can't work. And if you can't work, you can't pay me back." Richard froze, looking up at her through his fingers. "I am not forgiving the debt," Joe stated, her words striking like the blows of a hammer. "You owe Aegis Capital $150,000, plus a standard predatory corporate interest rate of 22% compounding annually. Mr. Higgins, you will draft a civil settlement today. Richard will agree to a wage garnishment of 50% of his gross income for the rest of his natural life, or until the debt is settled. If he misses a single payment, I will personally call the prosecutor and reinstate the push for maximum federal incarceration." Higgins looked at his client, then at Joe, utterly terrified by the ruthless genius of the play. He doesn't have a corporate job anymore, Mrs. Caldwell. He'll be working minimum wage. Then he better start picking up double shifts, Joe said, standing up from her chair and buttoning her blazer. "You wanted to be the alpha provider, Richard. Now's your chance to provide. She didn't wait for his response. She didn't need to. The total, utter devastation in his eyes was the only signature she required. Jo turned and walked out of the conference room, her heels clicking rhythmically against the marble floor. She walked out of the building, out into the bright Chicago sunshine, and slipped into the back of her waiting town car. "To O'Hare Airport, ma'am?" the driver asked. "Yes, please." Josephine Caldwell smiled, pulling out her phone to review the term sheets for a billion-dollar lithium mine. "Take me to the private terminal. I have an empire to build. If you loved this story of ultimate corporate revenge and want to hear more jaw-dropping true tales of karma, betrayal, and brilliant comebacks, make sure you hit that like button right now. It really helps the channel grow. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Have you ever had a partner underestimate you, only for you to prove them entirely wrong? Drop your story in the comments below. I love reading them. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that the best revenge is always massive success. See you next time, you.